So, thanks for coming. Is everyone's head spinning at the pace of this conference? Like 20-minute talk after 20-minute talk? I'm not used to that. So, 1,800, 2,000, yeah. If you had to do 2,000, you would do it the same way. Yes, introduction. This is my avatar on Drupal.org, on GitHub and GitLab, various Slacks. And the hat is supposed to remind you of the avatar. And I don't have time in 20 minutes to say more than that, but I'll be around after. I'm a member of the usability group for Drupal. I'm one of the co-maintainers of the migration subsystem, or the Migrate API, and I'm a member of the security team. And for the last year and a half, I've been working at Harvard Web Publishing, and I see a bunch of my colleagues in the room with me. So keep me honest. You can follow along. All of my slide decks are at this site, and you can find the link for this talk right at the top. And this is the outline. Talk about how did we get here, the plan, how to do it, what a 2-week sprint looks like, migrating 100 sites. I'll talk about iterating from one sprint to the next, and wrap things up. So how did we get here? There's a distribution of Drupal 7. Well, it's now there's also a Drupal 10 version called Open Scholar. Their slogan is the easiest way to power all of your institution's research websites. It was based on Drupal 7. It included the media module, control panel, virtual sites, a bunch of custom modules. It was a really good thing at the time. But the timeline it was that it started in 2009 as a research project. Gary King, who's still at Harvard, still the head of the Institute for Qualitative Social Science. I almost never say that out loud. It's always IQSS. I know that its presence on Drupal.org as a project was 1 year later, 2010. I'm not sure when the first release was, when people exactly started using it. But in 2017, it spun off into a private company and started marketing the Open Scholar distribution of Drupal to anyone who wanted it. As of today, there is a Drupal 10 version. They offer hosting, they offer support. And much of this timeline I cribbed from their website, theopenscholar.com. Open Scholar at Harvard. Everyone know what the Oprah effect is? You know, Oprah says, you get a car, and you get a car, and you get a car. Well, we're cheapskates. You get a website, you get a website, you get a website. So the Oprah effect is just that anyone with a university ID who wants a website gets a website for free with no follow-up. And what happens if you run that policy for 10, 12, 15 years with no governance? Well, the answer in our case is that we ended up with 12,000 sites. Not 2,000, not 1,200, 12,000. Most of them are tiny. Like graduate students are told, oh, you should set up your personal website, and they have one page for their publications and one page for the classes they're teaching and maybe a third page with photos, and that's about it. So 90%, maybe more than 90% are really tiny sites like that. But some of the 10%, are important high traffic sites, like the HUPD, the police department at Harvard University, has a public facing website. It's running on Open Scholar. The HR department, they have a few sites. There's one that has our private information, and that's a totally separate system. But there are at least 2 websites. One is totally open to the public, and one is open to Harvard community. Those are both Open Scholar. So a lot of sites, a bunch of them no one really wants anymore. But when you start with 12,000, even if 90% of them are either tiny or totally unwanted, that still leaves you with a lot of sites. So that's how we ended up in this case. We had 12,000 sites on Drupal 7. We knew that the Drupal 7 end of life was coming, and we had to get them migrated. So what was the plan? The first decision was, do we stick with OpenScholar, now a separate company, now having their Drupal 9 or 10 version available? Do we stick with them or not? And as I said at the start, I've only been with Harvard Web Publishing for a year and a half. Before my time, the decision was made to move off of their platform. So that was the first step. So once you make that decision, there are a few phases. First, you build out your platform on modern Drupal. You iterate, you refine, you have your design system, you just figure out what features are needed, you worry about the editorial experience, all of that. And the second phase is that you develop the migrations, you use Drupal's Migrate API, and that's going to get all of your content from these Drupal 7 sites into Drupal 10. And after you finish developing those migrations, you run those migrations on all the sites. So I'm just kidding. In fact, we sort of jumbled the three phases all together. We are still actively designing and implementing features and adding new components to the design system. The slide is out of date. I said we were still developing migrations until a few weeks ago. In fact, I noticed that a couple of days ago, some improvements for the migration were merged in. And the 2-week sprint that starts next week is going to be the last one where we do migrations. So that will benefit from those tweaks to the migrations that I noticed were merged in a couple of days ago. But that's where we are in the project. We're the next sprint, the one that starts next week, is going to be the last one where we migrate a bunch of sites. And even this late, we're still tweaking the migrations. We are certainly still developing the platform. Of course, once the migration is done, we'll continue to develop the platform. So how do you do it? First, let's talk about how you migrate one site. You have to worry about DNS. If there's going to be a URL going to your site, you have to have a DNS entry for it. You have to provision the site. We're doing that on Acquia Site Factory. You have to set up analytics. We're using GTM, Google Tag Manager, and Google Analytics. We have one theme but a bunch of variations, and so there are a bunch of little choices you make so that the medical school and the School of Government and the central administration sites are somewhat different, somewhat distinguishable, even though they're all on the Harvard brand using the same theme. But there are a bunch of variations that have to be chosen. You have to create an issue to track the progress of the migration. We do that in Jira. You actually have to do the migration. The down, across, and up, that's you pull down the database from production, which is sort of a silly step. Basically, the only difference between that and something you install locally is that the appropriate modules for Acquia are enabled. But anyway, you pull down the database, you migrate it locally, and then you upload the database. That's what the down, across, and up strategy means. Once all the content is migrated, we have a team, and I haven't talked much about the team, but we're working with an agency, and they have a bunch of developers who spend a lot of time cleaning up the sites that have just been migrated. Once they've done their job, it gets handed off to the site owner for review, and then shortly before lunch, you set up the single sign-on, and then you launch the site, and just launching is another few steps. I could break that down. So those are all the steps involved in migrating a single site. How do you migrate 1,800 sites? And the answer, of course, is one at a time, and of course, I'm just kidding. You migrate a bunch of sites at a time. What?
I thought that.
No! There's supposed to be a chart there.
You can visualize it.
Sure. What can I do? What can I do? What can I do? Oh, I know what I can do. This will take less than a minute. There we go. Escape. No, this one is broken too. I guess it's my fault. I didn't test that. Oh well, I'm sorry. Right, this is the live site, and it's sort of like your bell curve. It started off small. We had 33 two-week sprints, and it started off with the first 10 sprints had maybe 20 sites migrated in each sprint, and then it slowly rose. There was one sprint where we had 119 sites and one or two sprints with 100. And by the time we'd finished ramping up that far, we were beginning to run out of sites. So then we fell down to the other side of the bell curve. 1859 is not entirely accurate. I will know in a few days exactly how many sites are in the 33rd sprint. And to those of my colleagues who are thinking, isn't it 32? Remember, there was a sprint 0, or wave 0. So the communication is a huge challenge. 12,000 sites means 12,000 site owners. And the kill, keep, or combine exercise was an enormous task that I was not responsible for. Some of the people in this room were much more involved in that than I was. And we ended up killing about 10,000 sites, maybe a little more. 11,000? We decided to keep or migrate almost 2,000. It was kind of a fun exercise that we once combined 3 sites into one. There's at least 1 or 2 cases where we split one site into 2, but those were, as I say on the slide, only a handful. And just reaching out to that many site owners, figuring out how you could delegate that to department administrators and so forth, and get people on board was a really big undertaking. And it is the success of this process that means that I keep having to changing my title. Is it 2,000? Is it 18? A year ago we thought it would be 3,000 or 4,000, and as we kept going through the kill, keep, combined exercise, we kept deciding there were more and more sites that nobody actually wanted anymore. So what does a 2-week sprint look like with 100 sites in it? You don't want to manually go through that list of steps I gave you for migrating a single site. You have to automate it. So we start off in Google Sheets. We dump a bunch of data from the Drupal 7 sources. Someone goes in and says, keep this one, kill that one, blah, blah, blah. Someone else goes in and fills in the theme options. And then you extract from the huge master spreadsheet just one spreadsheet for the 100 or so sites that you're going to migrate in the current sprint. The problem with Google Sheets is that there are too many cooks. Too many people are touching it. Someone makes a stray click somewhere and a value gets deleted. Someone, I won't name names, puts a comment into a field that's supposed to have a URL in it. There's not enough data validation. So Google Sheets are great for collaboration. They are terrible for data validation. In Jira, we have one Jira story, it's a task or whatever, an issue per site. And the thing that Jira really gives us is it tracks the status of the site. Has it been provisioned? Has it been migrated? That meaning the automatic part of the process. Has it gone through manual cleanup? Is it in review? Has it been approved for launch? Has it been launched? And it tracks who owns the next step. Now, what is the common denominator, common format understood by both Google Sheets and Jira? Anyone?
CSV?
Yes, CSV files. Love CSV files. So we can import to and export from both Google Sheets and Jira. We can save and track our CSV files because they're just text files in a Git repository. When we make changes to them, we can review those changes with pull requests. And Google Sheets and Jira go away. Swipe down, yes. Jira, like Google Sheets, is too mutable. People can make changes to them. CSV files in the Git repository are much more reliable. The anatomy of a CSV file the CSV file for one sprint will have one row for each site that's going to be migrated. Some of the columns are the Open Scholar URL, the URL of the Drupal 7 site, the domain or the URL of the new site, a backup URL, a site factory group, which is more or less what school it belongs to, the machine name on Drupal 7, the machine name on Drupal 10, something to identify the project manager responsible for the site. On Site Factory, we have half a dozen or so different stacks. We have to keep track of that. And the theme recipe says what theme variations we're choosing. That's actually about a third of the columns we actually have. I didn't want to list all of them. And then we have a bunch of scripts, because another nice thing about CSV files being plain text files is that it's easy to manipulate them with PHP or even Bash scripts. So we have one script that prepares for a sprint, and it does a lot of validation. It checks for duplicates. It prepares a CSV file to hand off to the network people so they can make a DNS request. It creates another CSV file that we can import into Jira. Then we have scripts for setting up analytics, Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics. We actually have two scripts, we should probably combine them, that provision the sites. As I said on Acquia Site Factory, we actually have 4 scripts that we run when we launch the site. So we have a bunch of scripts that take these CSV files as input. Some of them produce other CSV files. Some of them execute other actions. One of the scripts that we developed fairly early on, oh yes, I really wanted it to be true that every site migrated in one sprint would get launched at the same time, not necessarily in the sprint, but all together, but that didn't happen. So we have to pull out sites from various different sprints and collect them together and say, gee, these are the ones we're going to launch all at once. We launch once a week on Tuesdays, so we have a script that does that. And you iterate. We started small, fewer than 25 sites in each of the first 10 sprints. We developed the scripts, we refined the process, figured out what would go wrong and fix it. So we improved our scripts, we improved our process. Basic agile methodology. And we discovered what the bottlenecks were. Like we always knew that the manual cleanup step was going to be a bottleneck, but there were other bottlenecks. Finding enough sites to be approved for migration was a serious problem for those first 10 sprints. I kept saying, give me more sprints. We need to migrate 100 in the sprint in order to stay on track. Because at that time, I still thought we were doing 4,000, not 2,000. The communications was a bottleneck. One project manager can only handle so many clients at once, so many sites. And those communications take a lot of time, and the project managers have to first make the keep or kill decision. Are we going to migrate it or not? Get approval to start the migration. Once it's been migrated, they have to get the site owner to approve for launch. And then launching is its own process. We cap it just because the more sites you have, the longer it takes, and the more problems you're going to run into. So there again is the summary. I am right on time. Damn, I'm good. Here are a few references. And any questions?
Can you go back to the last slide where you have the information?
Sorry, you want the QR code?
Yeah, the references.
Or just the references?
The references.
Yep. Nick?
How many people are involved in a 2-week sprint for migrating 100 sites?
How many people are involved in each sprint? So we have basically a couple of Drupal developers, and on our team, we're handling the launches, we're preparing the CSV files, we're working with Jacala, I think I mentioned that, and I apologize, I didn't have enough room on the slides to list the whole team. But we're working with Jacala, an agency, and they have, I don't know, 4 or 6 people just doing content smoothing. They have additional developers who are developing components and new features, fixing bugs. They have a couple of senior developers managing their team. And then we have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 project managers. And a couple of front-end developers, but I guess the front-end developers aren't really involved in the migration. Is that fair?
Very fair.
Okay. As I said, they're here to keep me honest. Yes?
More on the build side of the Drupal application. Did you have to build out a component library that you could reuse different components on the sites?
Yeah, we did build out a component library. I've not been much involved with that. But I talked earlier about the theoretical 3 phases you would have if you had enough time. But Jacala, back then was called FFW, did the majority of the design work. We have our own people in-house who do UX review, some of the front-end work. But it was largely developed by Jacala, and we were launching a few pilot sites, new sites, not migrated sites, on the platform before we started the migration. Does that answer the question?
A little bit, yeah.
I'd build on that real quick. There was a presentation by some other folks on our team earlier today called Dealing Aces. So when the links to all the different presentations go out after the event, definitely check out the Dealing Aces. It talks about our design system and accessibility componentry.
Right, it talks about how the design system does feed both our platforms, both Drupal 10 and also our WordPress.
Just briefly, for the sake of the recording, comments from my colleagues in the audience point out there's another presentation today called Dealing Aces that talks about our design system.
So this was more from perspective of governance and then trying to pull all the teams together to actually get the job done.
Yeah, what I'm talking today is largely about the governance. I would love to talk about the technical details of the migration, but not today.
Was this all, so I guess my question gets into more of the technical, but I'm very, very curious. So with that many number of sites, were you using the Drupal search API, or was there any Solr connections too that you had to deal with, or?
So the question is whether we used Drupal search API.
Yeah, was there a search function on these sites too that you had to?
So there is a search function. It's not directly related to the migration, but yes, part of the provisioning process. Did I not mention Solr? Part of the provisioning process is that we set up a Solr search index for every single site that we provision, and that's handled by the scripts and the API that Acquia provides, the CLI tool that they provide. Yes?
So great talk.
Thank you.
It's exciting to see. I think expediting moves from legacy to setting yourself up for future success and continued expansion is awesome. I'm curious, what was the sell-through process of pitching this? And if you were involved, it might have been before your time, right? But one thought might be take the tier 1 accounts and maybe let everything else almost go away, and if anybody else, put it back on and put it on the list to include in the 1,800 sites. So sort of the strategy of like assume it's all coming and pare down when you find you shouldn't bring it, or take Kennedy School, take Harvard University Publishing, whatever, and say these are our tier 1 moves that need to happen, and sort of do those and do 3 tier 1 sites first in the first sprint, or what have you. Like as you were thinking about the migration grouping and sort of the business impact visibility, like how'd that go?
Yeah, so for the sake of the recording, I'll summarize the question, sort of how did we sell the process, how did we schedule the important sites versus the smaller sites and so forth. So I don't think that we had to migrate high visibility sites in order to sort of socialize the fact that this was actually happening. It wasn't really optional. Like we were pretty firm. Drupal 7 end of life is coming. It's not optional to stay on the old platform long term. So the larger, more complex sites, there's one consideration pushing them towards the end of the process, which is that, as I said, we're doing everything at once. We're developing the migration scripts at the same time that we're actively migrating sites. And so the more complex the site is, the more it will benefit from the additional work we do on the scripts. So that tends to push it later. On the other hand, we don't want to push it too late because the larger, more complex sites are also going to need, even with that, they're going to need more additional manual fix-up. So I wouldn't say that there was any clear strategy for going for the important sites as soon as possible or putting them off till later. In the first few months, the first 10 sprints or so, when I was begging for more sites to be migrated, people didn't want to be first. That's sort of natural. And so it took a lot of arm twisting, it took a lot of talking, and again, some of the other people in the room are better able to talk about that than I am. Simon.
It's Rich.
Rich, sorry.
It's okay. So in terms of the approach that you took, was there any consideration given to like archiving, like as flat HTML? Was that ever part of the conversation, or it was just kind of whether or not to migrate?
The question is whether there was any consideration of archiving. No, we did not make static backups of any sites. The Drupal 7 installations are still running. I think one of the things I listed in the anatomy of the CSV file was a backup URL. So these backup URLs can now be used to access the Drupal 7 sites that are no longer public. Yes, in the back.
I'm curious if the new platform allows people to build sites. So like how long before you have 12,000 sites on the new platform?
How long will it be before we have 12,000 sites on the new platform?
Never!
Time will tell. Who knows? I'm sort of thinking, will there be a time where we have more newly built sites than migrated sites? So will we have 4,000 sites? At the moment, we typically get maybe a dozen or so new sites that we set up in a 2-week sprint. Will that increase? Time will tell. Yes?
I know you're focused more on the governance and a high-level process, but was there one technical challenge that was most interesting, or like a clever hack that you're most proud of, or anything that unblocked you?
All right. I did not plant this question, but someone asked me if there were any technical challenges that were particularly interesting to me. So some of the data was stored in serialized database columns, and we needed that information to extract from one large monolithic database just the information for a particular site. And The first thing I tried was just doing complicated joins with string matching in SQL statements based on that, and it was ridiculously slow. Like, it took minutes to do a count query. So I solved the problem by adding some columns to the database and running an initial SQL query just to fill these columns with a little bit of simple data extracted out of these serialized rows, and then doing joins on that pre-processed data. And that really opened things up.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, it's 3 o'clock. Thanks all.